Hello, everyone. My name is Joost Hilterman, and I'm the Program Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. And I'm very pleased to be here today and to moderate this panel on Libya, what has been happening there, and what are the challenges up ahead. The International Crisis Group, as many of you already know, is a conflict prevention organization. It's independent. We talk to all sides in conflicts, and we try to find peaceful, negotiated ways out of armed conflicts. We do so through our research in or near areas of armed conflict by talking to all the relevant actors and stakeholders. And we use our links in the capitals, in the major countries, global players, and others to press our ideas as to how to reduce the drivers of conflict. We have about 120 staff spread out throughout the world, and we work on about 55 conflicts. In relation to the subject today, I should note that we published a report very recently called Libya Turns the Page, and I would suggest that you look at that for more detail than what we can provide in 1 hour today. But we are very lucky to have with us a person who helped Libya turn the page, and another person who actually authored this page turner. So we have Stephanie Williams here. She was the Deputy Special Representative for Political Affairs for the United Nations from 2018 until 2020, and then was the acting special representative when Ghassan Salamé left, and was there during the very critical period that we are discussing today, and that led to the positive change in Libya. She has also been a former chargé, I can't speak French anymore, former chargé d'affaires at the United States Embassy in Tripoli, and she's currently co-authoring a book with Ghassan Salamé about their experiences with the UN in Libya. And so that's forthcoming and should make for very interesting reading. The other person, of course, is our own senior analyst for Libya, Claudia Gazzini. She's been with us for the last 9 years. She also, for a period of time in 2017, 2018, served as policy advisor to Ghassan Salamé, who was then the head of the UN support mission in Libya. So we're very pleased to have them. The format of the event is straightforward. There will be a half-hour back and forth between Claudia, Stephanie, and myself, sort of a limited Q&A. And then I will open the floor for a half hour of Q&A from the floor, and you can put your questions into the Q&A function. And then we will see that, and we will read out your questions. So please, and you can do that from whenever you feel. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session to start typing in your questions. But when you do so, please add your name and affiliation, because that's not always clear from your identifying name on the Zoom call. Finally, I should say that this session is being recorded and being live streamed on YouTube. So that's it. And so without further ado, I would like to start and address my first question to Stephanie Williams. And it's a very general opening question. Stephanie, how did we get where we are now? Because what we're seeing is really quite a dramatic change from where we were a year ago. A year ago, we were still in active fighting in Libya. There was an offensive against the capital, Tripoli. The Libyans certainly were at odds. The people were dying. But now, a year later, and a year is really not a long time, we are with an interim unity government looking towards elections later this year, and a ceasefire that has held, with a dividing line that is sort of in the middle of the country. All of that is rather surprising. How did it come to be?
So good afternoon, Joost, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Crisis Group and with my my friend and someone whose work I've admired and who taught me a lot about Libya, and that's Claudia. And I thought this recent report that Claudia wrote was right on target. So look, in writing the book with Ghassan, I've been obviously poring over, everything that we wrote and said over the last, 3.5 years. And I was looking at my Security Council briefing almost 1 year ago today. I delivered it in sort of late May of 2020. And you're absolutely right. Things still looked quite bleak then. And in fact, I told the members of the Security Council that I thought Libya might be slipping away from us because of the continuing levels of violence and the fact that Tripoli was being bombarded. Al Khadra hospital had been hit 4 times during that particular reporting period. That was the hospital, one of the primary hospitals to treat COVID patients in Libya. So we were dealing with COVID and conflict and human rights abuses. And this was even before, sort of the mass graves were discovered in Tarhuna. So yes, if you reflect back on the last year, we have come a long way. And that is due mostly to really the determination of the Libyans in the intra-Libyan tracks facilitated by the United Nations mediation to come together to sign the ceasefire, which solidified the cessation of hostilities that took place in June, to come together in the economic track to make important decisions about the unification of financial and sovereign institutions, to hold the first board meeting of the central bank in a number of years, and to agree the parameters of a unified budget, among other important decisions. Oil has resumed. Oil production has resumed again. In fact, production is increasing. That is very good. But on the political as well, the political actors came together. We saw the meetings in Tunis and Geneva. And one of the most important developments, of course, has been the maintenance of this international architecture, this diplomatic lattice under the parameters of the Berlin process. And so I was really pleased to see again today the announcement out of Berlin that there will be a follow-up conference, a ministerial, to be held, I believe now it's June 23rd, to sustain the momentum and to really because there are, the situation remains fragile and there are a number of challenges. And so which I'm sure we're going to get into. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, the mute button as usual. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Well, this leads me straight to the question for Claudia, which is also still, how did we get here? But Stephanie referred to the international architecture and the Berlin process and how important a role that has played and continues to play, hopefully, and how necessary it is. But can you say something more about the apparent international or regional convergence that enabled the return to some kind of accommodation on the ground between Libyans themselves? What happened in the past year that made this change possible?
Yeah, I think first of all, we should highlight that it wasn't a given that the country would come together. The conflict ended last June and created a divided country, a country that has been divided since 2014. It was a country that had the forces led by Khalifa Haftar in control of eastern Libya and parts of central Libya and parts of southern Libya, with their backers, which included the UAE, Egypt, Russia, and a western Libya controlled by the Tripoli and Misratan forces with its other backers, which include primarily Turkey. So this was the situation after the hostilities ended. And for some time, there was fear that that division would cement. Now, the international talks, this Berlin process that Stephanie referred to, helped move away from a state of frozen conflict that could have gone on for years, I must say, to a state of unity. And I think it was very important for the outside backers of the two sides to realize that it wasn't sustainable to continue the conflict. Well, they realized that because the conflict ended, but it wasn't sustainable to continue the state of frozen conflict because it would have required funding the Eastern forces and the Eastern government. They had, remember, they did not have access to oil revenue, so they did not have a self-funding process, so it would have required foreign funding to maintain. Yet on the Tripoli side also, because of the closure of the oil terminals and the stop of the oil flow, there was also the question of how these Tripoli-based authorities and its military coalitions would have been able to finance themselves. So it was key that the international actors and the backers of the two sides somehow came around the table with the UN mediation, thanks in large part to the previous envoy, Ghassan Salamé, who understood that it would have been difficult to bring together Libyan factions that are not divided into 2, 3, 4, or 5, but are divided into many, many different segments. It would have been difficult to bring the Libyan factions together if first the internationals did not agree on a common vision for Libya. So this was key to break the state of frozen conflict and to actually move forward towards a unity of Libya. Of course, a change in the US administration also helped. And we're still talking about the days of Trump, but it was a change of posture of the administration at the time. Remember when the conflict in Libya began, when the siege on Tripoli began in April 2019, there was a tacit blessing by Washington for this offensive to take place. And what was said was to Haftar, if you want to do it quick. But 1 year later, that position changed, and the US administration was key in stopping the hostilities and in pushing towards an agreement for the unity of Libya. Another factor on the international scene that contributed, of course, was a great gradual de-escalation between Gulf rivals. Remember, part of the reason why the Libya conflict escalated in the past few years was a reflection of also of the Gulf dispute. So you had Qatar on one side and the Emirates on the other that were playing out their regional rivalries also on Libyan soil. So since January, we also saw a de-escalation on that front, and that helped move the process forward. And likewise, we're seeing gradual de-escalation between Egypt and Turkey, two other very important regional rivals that have started to dialogue. So all these factors contributed to pushing forward the political process that we're seeing realizing itself and coming to fruition now.
Just to follow up, Claudia, because you mentioned a number of de-escalatory things that happened, but there was also an escalation that contributed to it, because well before the US elections, and what probably brought the two sides together was the escalation by Turkey in Libya. And I think it deserves mention, even if it's raised the risk of an escalation of the overall conflict. But in the end, we saw instead that Turkey managed to push back against Haftar's forces, but didn't go all the way to, say, the Egyptian border or all the way to defeat Haftar. That in itself may also have contributed to a way forward, political way forward. How do you rate that? And is that linked to the overall de-escalation that is happening in the region between Turkey and Qatar on one side and UAE on the other, which came a bit later?
Yes, I mean, you're very right to mention Turkey's intervention. What Turkey's intervention did at the end of 2019, so it was already 6 months into the war when Haftar forces had moved from central Libya to the outskirts of Tripoli, and really the front lines were in the city itself. And there was the risk that Tripoli would fall. So the Sarraj government at the time would not be able to keep up its resistance against this siege. And the government in Tripoli sent out requests for help. And they asked the Americans, they asked my fellow Italians, Algerians, and other military allies that had supported the counterterrorism efforts in Libya to intervene, and and Turkey responded. And there's no doubt that the military support lent by Turkish forces in the form of drones, military assistance, but mainly aerial defenses helped turn the tide of the Tripoli war. As you mentioned, Turkey's intervention could have continued the conflict in a certain sense, because it did enable to push back Haftar-led forces. They were pushed back to central Libya. And for a brief moment over the summer, there was talk in Tripoli to actually move further east. So with the help of Turkish aerial support and air defenses, there were plans being made to move into eastern Libya, and Tripoli-based politicians were also saying, we cannot end the war without a full victory, and the full victory means marching all the way to the eastern border. But fortunately, that did not happen, in part thanks to US diplomacy. And so and Turkey was also in a moment in which it was isolated internationally in the region. It faced these Arab rivals that were very much opposed to what was perceived as sort of a Turkish expansionist policy in the region. And at a certain point, sort of agreed to stop. It had made its point. And the point was, we do not want to see an encroaching Emirati Egyptian influence all across North Africa. It had showed that its military power could be delivered on the other side of the Mediterranean and help stop an offensive. And then therefore use this opportunity to open channels of communication. Again, thanks also to the support of US diplomats. So Turkey essentially used this military victory, but for them it was also a moral victory, to say that Turkey helped prevent the collapse of Tripoli in order to open up negotiations. And on the other side, there was also a recognition that this was a new reality in Libya that you had to contend with, and there was no use in continuing a war when there was another military backer, Turkey, that was there on the ground, and therefore this chimera of a military victory in Tripoli would no longer be possible.
Thanks, Stephanie. Give us an inside-out view. You're sitting there in Libya, in Tunisia, talking to Libyans every day as part of your job, trying to bring people together. And for a long time, it doesn't work. Year after year, you were there 3 years or so. It must be extremely frustrating. And then suddenly, the international situation, the regional situation seems to shift. And suddenly the military commanders are talking to each other, across the lines, talking to each other. How did you experience that exactly? How does that work? When you're sitting there as the United Nations trying to mediate, and suddenly, how do the attitudes of the Libyan actors change in response to these international developments? And how does that translate then into changes on the ground, politically, diplomatically, militarily, maybe also economically?
So the process that we initially constructed, going back before the attack on Tripoli in April of 2019, was an inside-out process where the focus was, in fact, going to be on the Libyans themselves. That, of course, was preempted by the attack on Tripoli. Now, you don't want to overemphasize the international and regional role, because what essentially happened over the last year, and particularly between, I would say, October and continuing to today, is the Libyans coming together under this international, this regional umbrella, which is important. So we knew, and oftentimes we had to explain this and re-explain this in many capitals that we visited, that you could not have a Libyan process that was confined to two individuals. So we had the sort of Siraj, Haftar, duopoly, or the quartet of Siraj, Haftar, Aguila, and Mishri, that was not going to really produce a comprehensive solution to the Libyan crisis. So we started, with this, this core belief that what was needed was a fully inclusive process. And that's what we built around the political dialogue that took place in Tunis, where we didn't rely on the two assemblies, we didn't rely on the two gentlemen. We literally opened up the tent, particularly bringing in more ethnic constituencies, women, civil society, tribal, with geographic participation, representation. So that was key. Now, the political process was greatly enabled and given a boost by the military actors coming together. So that was your 5+5. And here again, this was a Libyan decision. This was a Libyan decision that was enabled by the calm on the ground, which boosted their trust and confidence in each other. But so you have this irony, this dynamic of foreign intervention, with the reliance on foreign assistance, propelled Haftar to try and achieve his long-term ambitions to take control of the capital. But at the same time, that foreign interference led to the invitation to Turkey coming in, which then it brought this halt to the conflict. But at the same time, because there was so much intervention, the Libyans did feel that they were losing control of their country. They felt this enormous loss of sovereignty. And so it was the Libyan participants, the 5+5, the members of the Joint Military Commission, who asked for the meeting in Geneva. And here I have to say we were rather helped by Egypt. The month before, at the end of September, they held a sort of mini 5+5 with some representatives from both sides in the city of Hurghada. That was a nice warm-up session for what took place in Geneva and the signing of the ceasefire, where this was a Libyan product that we helped them with, but it had all of their imprimatur. And most importantly, it carried the weight of their decision on the need for the, for instance, the foreign forces to leave, but also the request to me as the UN mediator that I move with alacrity, that the UN move quickly to convene the political actors with the purpose of moving towards elections under the aegis of a united temporary executive. They felt that was very important to sort of solidify all of these gains. And that's exactly what we did. Elections were announced in November. The temporary unified interim government was established in February and then approved by the House of Representatives in March.
You've just laid out a classic case of conflict resolution, I think, and the mechanics of it, or the main components of it. In the literature, various terms are used that explain how a conflict can turn into something, can take a positive turn towards peace efforts. And people talk about sort of the hurting stalemate. I think this is a Bill Zartman term that certainly occurred here after Turkey pushed back Haftar's forces out of the capital. That's what it came to. And a hurting stalemate also happens when neither side, and then talk about the Libyans and their external sponsors, but neither side has escalation dominance, has the means and the will to outdo the other. And I think there was exhaustion on both sides in terms of how many resources they were willing to spend on a conflict in Libya that, you know, Turkey is not Libya, UAE is not Libya, et cetera, et cetera. So, but you have to match that, and I think you brought that out very clearly, the existence also of a way out, of hope, of opportunity, and an agency, the United Nations and its mechanisms, to act with alacrity, as you said. And I think all of these ingredients came together, and so it's a classic case, really, of a conflict turning into a peace opportunity. But I have a follow-up for you, because it's very sensitive, of course. It's very tricky for outsiders to come in and mediate conflicts. Conflicts are very personal, very local. They start often locally. Outsiders come in, they're resented, they're brought in. Sometimes, conflict actors want outsiders to come in to help them, but in the end, they're also resented for being overbearing and, pursuing their own agendas. And then as the UN, you come in, and it's a very tricky situation, because we're outsiders, we're foreigners, don't necessarily know the language and the culture very well, if at all. How was that interaction for you? How did you manage to survive and succeed in that environment?
Well, I certainly didn't do it alone. There was a great, UN team who was beside with me throughout, and of course, the support, the critical support of this international architecture. But, I have to say it was really also the Libyans, themselves. And I, what I saw and what I hope will continue, and I think this is very important as we look at the challenges ahead, and particularly the need to reach the elections, which what I saw on all three tracks was this desire to put the common good above personal interests, above party interests, above parochial interests. And you mentioned what drove them to this. There was a great deal of exhaustion, watching the country continue to fragment on almost this atomic level, to see the infrastructure continue to crumble, the crippling electricity cuts, the effect of the COVID pandemic on the economy, the fact that there was this use of hate speech and social media, which was playing such a negative role, throughout the mediation. Frankly, this desire by, I think, a lot of Libyans with goodwill, who dream of a stable and prosperous and democratic country. They came together, and that's really that's the kind of momentum and the goodwill that needs to be maintained going forward. So, we were there to facilitate and to certainly offer our suggestions, our recommendations on how to bridge. There were understandable, and there still are understandable gaps, because these are critically important national decisions that they are taking. And in this, I think the transparency in the process is also very important. It's something we started to implement. We implemented in Tunis with greater effect in Geneva. And I was really pleased to see that the LPDF session that was held virtually a couple of days ago was fully, broadcast live to the Libyan public. This is exactly, and by the way, it's not just good for Libya, it's good for the region, for these kinds of national discussions to be held so transparently.
Thanks, Stephanie. You referenced to the LPDF, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. Claudia, first of all, can you just say a little bit about the role of that forum in getting us where we are today, and what the legitimacy of it is? Because we now have an elected government, but it's not a popularly elected government. So it's essentially, it came out of the dialogue forum. How much legitimacy does it have? Is that a problem for where we go next? And what are the main challenges that we face as Libya moves towards elections. Just in a few words, and after that, I'm going to open up the floor.
Yeah, sure. But before that, I just wanted to add a few words on what Stephanie said. I mean, what helped the UN mediation was also a large distrust that exists in Libya for its own political class. Because many Libyans, are very wary of those members of parliament that have been in power for many years, for stakeholders who have been in seats of power endlessly. And so there's more popular support for the UN and for UN mediation, because many people feel that they're not going to get a solution just by trusting their political class. And this brings me to your question on the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. It, of course, has its critics. This forum is a group of 74 representatives of Libya's various factions. 13 of these are members of the parliament. Other 13 are members of the rival assembly based in Tripoli called the High State Council, and the others are delegates chosen by the United Nations, but representative of civil society, women, and political constituencies. So there are some Libyans that say, well, this is not an elected body. Who are these people? What do they represent? Who chose them? But actually, there is overall widespread support for this forum, because there's an understanding that the existing political institutions have almost reached a dead end and would not be able to enact or trigger change. And that's why the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which the UN backs, has still a role to play. It helped create a consensus over this new government that is headed by Dbeiba, a consensus that was essentially created thanks to a procedure that was agreed upon, because it was put to the vote which person would become the new prime minister, and this procedure was accepted. So I hope the next step that the Libyan political dialogue has to play is to agree once again on an internal procedure on how to move this political process forward, because the next step is elections, and they have to take place in one form or another, and there's still disagreement on that.
Thanks, Claudia. So already we have quite a few questions in the Q&A. I would invite both Claudia and Stephanie to glance at it, but let me ask a question that links up to this one from Peter Millet, the date of the elections, because what we saw in 2015 with the Scherat talks, there was a real effort and desire by the United Nations in particular to get the thing done, to get something in place, a structure in place. And I remember very well at Crisis Group at the time, we said this is a rushed process and the results cannot be good if it's rushed. You need to have some kind of internal consensus about the way forward. There's a similar risk with going ahead with elections when that consensus is still lacking. How important is it to have these elections by the end of this year versus having a more drawn out process that maybe lacks the popular legitimacy, but that at least can work out some of these difficult issues along the way? It's a very difficult balance. What do you do first? It's a chicken and egg problem almost. I don't know, if Stephanie, you want to give that a try? Yeah, please.
Yeah, sure. So look, the most important reason to have the elections is because an overwhelming majority of Libyans want national elections. Poll after poll, you're looking at numbers in the 70 and 80%. So, okay, you need to respond to this really demand on the part of the public for national elections. And the date of December 24th, which was selected by the LPDF last November, it coincides with Libya's, the 70th anniversary of Libya's independence. So there's a symbolic importance to this date. Also, there's overwhelming support for holding national elections on time. And here's why, here are other reasons why you need them. You still have, Claudia mentioned this as well, you have a crisis of legitimacy of the current institutions. The House of Representatives and the Higher State Council, their terms expired long ago. Higher State Council, 2012. HOR 2014. You have an interim temporary unified government. There's an implicit contract that has been signed in Tunis and in Geneva that this is a bridge towards national elections wherein Libyans will choose their representatives. And it is only a fully sovereign, democratically elected government, representative government, that can really tackle a lot of these underlying issues, the structural reform that's needed in the economic and sovereign institutions, the reform and the ultimate disposition of the military institution, which is a very important topic. What kind of military do Libyans want? Making that institution fit for purpose. Charting Libya's, sovereign relations with regard to, its defense partnerships, trading partnerships. All of that needs to be done by a democratically elected, sovereign, representative government. So you've got that. You've got the fact that you have a constitutional chamber right now of the higher court that's been closed. It's been closed. They shuttered their doors because what the political class does, the status quo political class, is they resort to legalisms and precedents in order to essentially obstruct the way forward. And this is all to say that there is a momentum in the country. We have seen in the last several months. Now there is this really surge amongst civil society. You have NGOs. You have a movement for elections. These are led by youth, but also by women. It is time for the current political class to step aside. There's a new generation of political leaders waiting to contribute to the country. So time is of the essence. I think this month is going to be critical. I do think that the regional rapprochement that we've seen between the Turks and the Egyptians can be helpful in this regard, but also more broadly, the international support for elections.
Great, thank you. Claudia, there's a question here from Sharif Al-Ashmawi. And I think it's a good one because it raises a classic problem with elections in post-conflict societies and the early transitions. There's a risk in having elections so early. Maybe it's necessary. Maybe Libyans overwhelmingly want them. It certainly would give legitimacy to the elected government. But what would happen to the balance in a highly polarized situation between two or three centers of power in a country, if they're not represented in the elected government? It's possible, of course. Hopefully, you would get a government that actually represents the whole country sort of evenly, but it's not inevitable at all. So what would happen if it could just continue the conflict in a different way? What do you think?
Well, first of all, we have to take a step back because there are different issues when we're talking about elections in Libya. One is a parliamentary election and the other is presidential. Now, the debate is wide open. And as you know, Joost and Stephanie knows very well, it's a very polarized debate in Libya. There are those that think that there should only be parliamentary elections. And they think that this is a safeguard for future polarization. The idea is let there be a parliament elects representatives from all around the country, and therefore let them choose the next prime minister. This will safeguard and create a kind of power sharing and regional representation in the next government. And then there are those who say we ought to also have a presidential election, right? Arguing that actually a presidential model in Libya is much better, where you have clear powers in the hands of one person, directly elected by the people. I think there are people who oppose this presidential election fiercely and say that there's a risk that will return Libya to a state of authoritarianism, because there will be too much power in the hands of one leader that has a direct, popular vote, which gives him more even moral authority. Now, the debate is complicated and is difficult to decide what would be better. But I think certainly when we're talking about the risk for polarization and the risk for sort of winner take all mentality, certainly with the presidential vote, there is this greater risk. And there is this greater risk because there is that type of election brings about one winner, right? Whereas a parliamentary vote brings about many elected members of parliament. So there's less polarization inherently in that process. The UN doesn't really fall on one side or the other side of the debate, has maintained rightfully a very neutral position. This is up to the Libyans to decide. But in my interactions with Libyans, there is overwhelmingly across the country this aspiration for a president. It's always been there. So I think this would be a natural course of action, with the caveat that yes, a presidential campaign, or a campaign between political actors over the post of the president, does risk being highly polarized. And that's where we need to have a process that ensures, if this is the road that will be agreed upon, we need to have international assurances that the results will be respected, that certain steps need to be taken in order to safeguard what comes after.
So both of you have already addressed actually a number of the issues that were raised in the Q&A function. But one we haven't addressed yet, and it has two parts to it. It has to do with the elections as well. But we continue to see a lot of insecurity in the country, and there are not really two military sides. There are both sides are divided into militias to some extent, with their own agendas and priorities and ambitions. So how would that work with elections in particular? And then there's foreign forces still, be they private security contractors or other groups brought in by the external sponsors. They still need to leave, but will they leave in time for the elections? What would happen if they're still there? How do you see that? Stephanie, you want to give that one a go?
Sure. Well, I mean, the good thing is that there is now, a functioning joint military commission that now has its headquarters in the city of Sirte in central Libya. There have been a number of meetings. There is a lot of interaction between the Joint Military Commission and the International Security Working Group, which comes under the Berlin process. And within the ceasefire agreement, and then you have sort of the sub-agreements or the subcommittees that have been set up under the 5+5, you have ways to tackle all of this. Again, I mean, the whole sort of security architecture, security sector reform, DDR, is not something, that is going to be accomplished in the next 6 months. So that's, simply, unrealistic. This is a years-long, almost generational project, which is going to require a big lift by the elected government, as well as assistance, from the international community. But the 5+5, can be helpful in terms of the intersection with the Ministry of Interior for electoral security. It's something that, even going back, I mean, when I joined the United Nations in 2018, there's an ongoing process working with the Higher National Elections Commission, working with the Ministry of Interior, working with various military actors on what electoral security, needs to look at. I do not think that this should be an obstacle for elections. And I can see that people are sort of using it now, brandishing it. But I do think that we can press ahead, that, you know, through the 5+5 architecture, through the now unified Ministry of Interior, and that's very important. There's going to have to be a lot of focused work on this and focused international diplomacy. The call for the mercenaries to depart remains as legitimate today as it was on October 23rd. I think it is just a real stain, you know, that these countries have not have not done the needful, have not, you know, respected the Libyan request to depart their country. I think that's also something that this upcoming foreign ministerial in Berlin, you know, can start to address. There's also, you know, I understand Libya is going to be on the agenda of the summit between President Biden and President Putin on June 14th in Geneva. So this needs to be, you know, seriously tackled, not only for Libya's internal security, but as we've seen, because there's an impact on regional security and certainly security in the Sahel.
Thank you. Claudia, a question from Paul Raymond of Agence France Presse. Now that the fighting is over, he says, what do the sides' respective backers, UAE, Turkey, Russia, etc., want to gain from the peace, and will they continue to interfere in ways that will harm Libya's future?
Oh, very good question. I mean, all these countries want the political process to move forward, but they do have their sort of conditions that are informed by their posture over the years. They want the political process to move forward because many of these, Turkey, Egypt next door, Russia to a certain extent, want to do business with Libya. They want to have Libya as a solid working country that they can sell to, bring projects. And they need a functioning country to do that. And they know that the dysfunction of Libya of the past 10 years is not good for business. Okay, but their conditions differ, of course. For the Haftar backing countries, a red line still seems to be the conservation of that army, the Libyan National Army that General Haftar heads, as a skeleton for Libya's future security infrastructure. And at the moment, they do not want to touch this status quo. So they're willing to support, it seems to me, a political process, in so long as, for the time being, this skeleton security force is not dismantled or touched or put at risk in any way. So they want guarantees that funding towards this military will continue. On the other hand, for Turkey, the political process is important. Turkey, of all of them, perhaps is the one that is most interested in doing business with Libya. Its own economy depends on expanding its markets, but it wants a political process that, in certain sense, guarantees Turkey's own strategic interests that are a maritime delimitation deal that Turkey signed with the previous government in Tripoli in 2019. It's a maritime deal that allows Turkey to position itself in the East Med over other gas deals with other countries. So it's of strategic importance. And for Turkey as well, it wants to be sure that the future of Libya, again, doesn't fall into the orbit of its what was until recently its Arab regional rivals. So they have, they still have strategic rivalries, but for the time being, and this is new, they are all supportive of this current political process because they They know that despite the differences, they have more to gain by working with this political project than undermining it.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask Stephanie, you mentioned earlier and went into some detail about reaching out to Libyans more broadly. And there's a question here from Mats Benjamin Gnam at the University of Kiel. What kind of role can local governments play in stabilizing the country? This is a good question, because we often see in conflicts that are national level conflicts, there are oases of peace or areas that remain relatively shielded, where governance continues, and they could play a very positive role in a transition because they have an experience of governing despite difficult situations. How do you see that play out in Libya?
So that's a great question, and yes, indeed. I mean, the municipal councils of Libya are heroic, and these are local councils that have worked throughout COVID, conflict, misgovernance, central misgovernance, lack of provision of resources, and these amazing councils. And we visited, when we would, go around Libya, our first stop would be at the local municipal council to meet with the mayor, members of the council, and then often the mayors and the council would invite in, civil society, NGOs, other groups. And we always ask to see women, of course, and they, have the pulse. So they are really important, which is why I set up this subtrack for the political dialogue forum. So in advance of the Tunis meeting, I had 3 subtracks. We had the women's subtrack, youth subtract, and the municipal council subtract. And, for each subtract, we had rapporteurs. So we spoke to almost all of the municipal councils across Libya. And we had to do this via Zoom because of the COVID conflict, but we took their input, and that was fed directly into the LPDF participants as they gathered in Tunis. And indeed, I mean, this call for implementation of existing laws, like the existing legislation law 59 for decentralization, because there is this fear of over centralization, whether through a figure of one personality or this just grip of the government in Tripoli on the resources. But here's another reason I think why the municipal councils in Libya are so critical, because guess what? Throughout COVID, throughout conflict, we had municipal council elections happening in Libya. Were they at the level of participation that everyone was satisfied with? No, we would like to have seen more and more. But these municipal council elections were organized, they were held. The Central Municipal Council Election Commission is an amazing group of people. They're quiet, unsung heroes who do this, day and night. But what it demonstrated was this great thirst in Libya for democratically elected representative government. And this is, again, I think, where Libya has an opportunity now to distinguish itself in this region, where you have this horrible presentation of the false choice, the choice of the mosque or the barracks. What about, it's the divine right of the kings, the shuyukh, the presidents for life, as we've just, seen recently, or you have, sort of the divine right of the clerics. What happened to the divine right of the people to choose their representative government? And that's where, you have it at the grassroots level in Libya, and now you have an opportunity to realize this at the national level. That's why the municipal councils are so important.
Indeed they are, thank you. Then we come to the difficult, one of the more difficult questions in every conflict and transition. We see that the military aspect is always the hardest one to resolve. How to unify the military, and I know that's not going to happen in the coming year, of course, before elections, but But in the case of Libya in particular is the question of Haftar's large shadow, because he may have ambitions to run for president if there are presidential elections. He may not agree to having the Presidential Council be the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. You know, he has had his ambitions. You know, what kind of role is conceivable for him in a situation where you're going to have elections sometime in the not too distant future, hopefully? Claudia, what's your thinking on this?
Well, again, the criteria for who can run in these elections is another big topic of debate in the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. It sees Libyans very divided between those who say that any Libyan should be allowed to run for a position in these elections, and others who would like to impose restrictions. And one of the proposed restrictions is, of course, whether you're a military or not. So we'll have to see at the end of the day who will run and who can run. Certainly, we always, I mean, there's a general very strong anti-Haftar narrative in Libya, especially in Tripoli, because, you know, they see people who lived in Tripoli who were under siege by Haftar forces see him as, you know, the cause of these 3,000 or more deaths, destruction of the city, a futile war from their point of view. But we often forget, and they often forget, that for other people in eastern Libya, Haftar still remains, you know, the person who did launch this dignity operation that did help, from their point of view, eradicate jihadists from that area, that did eradicate radical Islamist group from Benghazi, and did prevent this eastern city, which is Libya's eastern city, from falling under their rule, and another city in Derna. So for other Libyans, he remains a hero. Okay, so what Haftar's whether Haftar will be allowed to run for elections or not is up to the Libyan political delegates to decide. But whether he can actually take on a political position will be for the electorate to decide at the end of the day. And we'll have to see what the majority of the population feels like. I feel that for Libya to turn a page, and our report is Libya Turns a Page, we don't need the controversial people of the past to polarize even more the discourse. This is to turn the page. You also need to have a fresh start, and you can't have a fresh start if you have controversial actors that are, you know, not accepted so fiercely by one part of the population, making a claim. So it's time, I think, to make room for others. But since we're on this topic, just one last note that I would like to recall. In our report, we highlight one crucial challenge, which is the question of who is supposed to be considered the top authority, the top civilian authority overseeing unification of the military and the appointments of new military, you know, the top military positions. And at the moment, there's still some controversy over this, because the UN-backed process envisages the Presidential Council, these three men, as the supreme commander of the Libyan armed forces. But this has not been fully and legally ratified and recognized by the parliament. So I think a first step in order to ensure that we're not going to have further controversies over the military and the military unification in Libya would be to address this issue and to ensure that what is implicitly implied by the roadmap is made explicit.
Okay, the hour has flown by, and we have only 1 minute left. I would like to ask Stephanie to give some final observations before we close.
So I think we continue to be at a moment of opportunity in Libya. It's fragile. There are many challenges ahead. I think at the international level, you have now, as we reflect 2019, which for Libya was the year of international disorder, you now have, a sort of restoration of international order, and you certainly have renewed leadership from the United States, and that's very important. And we've seen the United States lead on Libya, and that they need to continue to do that. I think this follow-up meeting, this ministerial on June 23rd of the Berlin process is going to be very important. And it's important that the Libyans see the international community coming together to reiterate support for the elections and continuing stabilization of Libya. For Libyans themselves, there have been important steps on national reconciliation. And most recently, we saw the Presidency Council launch this just yesterday. That needs to be sustained. There are a number of issues related to this file which need to be tackled. And you've seen the Presidency Council and ministers reaching out to populations like in southern Libya who have been neglected for many years. That has to be sustained. And above all of the key Libyan actors in the three tracks in this process need to put the common good above their own personal and parochial interests. That's what has, moved the Libyan tracks to where they are, and that needs to be continued going forward.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you both for spending an hour enlightening our audience. I certainly found the discussion fascinating. I want to wish you luck, Stephanie, in finishing your book with Ghassan on the process. I look forward to reading it. Thank you, Claudia, also, of course, always for your insights. And thank you to our guests for attending. And I have to apologize if we didn't get to all of your questions. It was not possible. I tried to group them by theme. But in any case, this is an ongoing conversation, and there will be opportunities in the future. I think the link to our recent report, Libya Turns the Page, is in the Q&A. And I have nothing else to say except enjoy the rest of your day, and may the peace process in Libya have a very good conclusion. So thank you, and till the next occasion. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joost. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Joost.